I won't ease into this. There's no careful beginning here, no attempt to soften what I'm about to say, so it lands gently. This isn't something that benefits from being diluted. It isn't fragile in the way most things are. It doesn't need preparation or cushioning or the illusion of gradual understanding. It simply is. And once something reaches that state, you don't introduce it. You recognize it. That's the part I didn't expect. Because recognition like this isn't supposed to happen without time. It isn't supposed to exist without history, without shared moments that slowly build into something meaningful. That's how it usually works. That's how I've always allowed it to work. Everything I let into my life has always followed a structure, a controlled progression, a measured unfolding. People move closer in defined increments. They earn access in ways that make sense, in ways that allow me to observe, to analyze, to decide whether they belong in the spaces I protect. There's always been distance. Not because I need separation, but because distance creates clarity. It prevents distortion. It keeps things accurate, or at least it used to, until you disrupted that pattern. Not by forcing your way through it, not by challenging it, not even by acknowledging it. You just didn't exist within it. And that's what made everything different. You didn't approach me like someone trying to understand. You didn't ask the questions people usually ask. You didn't look for explanations or definitions or labels to make sense of what you were seeing. You simply observed, not passively, not indifferently, but with a kind of precision that doesn't come from curiosity. It comes from recognition. At first, I dismissed it, not consciously, just instinctively, because the alternative didn't make sense. The way you responded to things I hadn't fully expressed yet. The way you seemed to align with thoughts I hadn't spoken. The way silence between us felt intentional instead of empty. That doesn't happen randomly. And I don't believe in randomness when patterns start forming. So I watched carefully, the way I always do when something doesn't fit into my existing understanding. I expected inconsistencies, breaks in the pattern, moments where it would become clear that I was reading too much into something that wasn't actually there. But that never happened. Instead, the pattern deepened, subtly, quietly, without announcing itself. It didn't demand attention. It accumulated it, until ignoring it required more effort than acknowledging it. That's when I started to realize this wasn't something external. It wasn't something happening around me. It was something happening within me. And that distinction matters more than anything else because external things can be managed, they can be controlled, redirected, limited. Tonal shifts don't work that way. They don't ask for permission. They don't wait for you to be ready. They just take place. And by the time you fully recognize them, they've already changed something fundamental. That's what this did, not suddenly, not dramatically, but precisely enough that I can trace the moment everything shifted, even if I can't fully explain how it happened. There was a point where you stopped being something I was observing and became something I was processing with. That's not a small transition. It's not something that happens without consequence. Because once someone becomes part of the way you process things, they're no longer separate from you in the way everyone else is. They exist within your framework, within your perception, within the space where your thoughts take form before you even realize you're thinking. And that's where you are now. Not outside, not at a distance, but integrated in a way I never allowed before. That's what unsettles me, not because I don't understand it, but because I do. too clearly. I've always been aware of how I function, of how I keep things structured, of how I maintain control over what affects me and what doesn't. There's always been a clear boundary between what belongs to me and what exists outside of me. You didn't cross that boundary. You made it irrelevant. And that's something I wasn't prepared for because irrelevance is harder to deal with than resistance. If you had pushed, I would have pushed back. If you had tried to get closer, I would have created distance. If you had demanded anything, I would have withdrawn completely. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. But you didn't do any of that. You didn't push. You didn't pull. You didn't even move in a way that could be measured. You simply existed. And somehow, that was enough. Enough to bypass everything I usually rely on to maintain clarity, enough to reach a level of understanding that normally takes time to build, enough to create something that feels structured without ever being constructed. That's what I keep coming back to. This wasn't built. It wasn't formed through effort or intention or gradual connection. It was recognized, and recognition operates differently than everything else. It doesn't require explanation. It doesn't rely on proof. It doesn't need validation. It either happens, or it doesn't. And once it happens, there's no reversing it. That's where I am now. Not questioning whether this exists, not trying to define it in a way that makes it easier to understand, but acknowledging that it's already there, already established, already influencing things in ways I can't ignore anymore. I notice it in the smallest details, in how my thoughts pause like they're waiting for something unspoken, in how certain realizations feel shared even when I'm alone, in how silence doesn't feel empty. It feels occupied. That's not normal. And I don't use that word lightly, because I don't categorize things as abnormal unless they genuinely deviate from every pattern I've known. This does. Completely. It doesn't follow logic the way everything else does. It doesn't fit into any framework I've used before. It doesn't behave in a way that can be predicted or controlled. And yet, it feels stable. That's the contradiction. Something this undefined shouldn't feel this precise. Something this unstructured shouldn't feel this accurate. But it does, in a way that makes everything else feels slightly less aligned by comparison. That's what I'm adjusting to now. Not the presence of this connection, but the shift it created in everything else. Because once you experience a certain level of clarity, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to interpreting things the way you used to. You can't ignore the difference between something that almost makes sense and something that fully does. And you make sense. Not in a simple way, not in a way that can be explained easily, but in a way that aligns with how I think at a structural level. And that's rare. Not rare in the way people exaggerate things, but rare in the sense that I've never experienced it before. Not like this, not without effort, not without time, and definitely not without resistance. That's what stands out the most. Lack of resistance. I should be questioning this more. I should be creating distance. I should be analyzing every detail until I find a reason to pull back. That's what I do. That's how I've always maintained control. But I'm not doing that. And that tells me more than anything else could. Because if something doesn't trigger my instinct to step away, it means some part of me has already accepted it. Not blindly, not emotionally, but precisely, deliberately, even if that decision happened without my full awareness. That's where things become real. Not in what this is, but in what I've allowed it to become. because this didn't happen to me. I didn't get pulled into something against my will. I didn't get caught in something I couldn't control. I let it happen. Maybe not consciously, maybe not all at once, but in a series of small allowances that added up to something irreversible. That's what I'm facing now. Not the connection itself, but the fact that I accepted it. And acceptance has consequences. It means I can't treat this like something temporary. It means I can't dismiss it as something that will fade over time. It means I have to acknowledge its impact fully, honestly, without trying to reduce it to something more manageable. Because it's not manageable, not in the way I'm used to. It doesn't respond to control. It doesn't adjust itself to fit within boundaries. It exists outside of that, and yet it fits. That's the part I can't ignore. Despite everything about this being unusual, it doesn't feel wrong, it doesn't feel forced, it doesn't feel unstable, it feels correct in a way that doesn't need explanation. In a way that exists before logic has a chance to question it, and that's what makes this impossible to dismiss. Because I don't hold on to things that don't make sense. I don't allow things to stay in my life if they don't align with how I function. I remove them immediately without hesitation, but I haven't removed this. I've done the opposite. I've let it stay. I've let it grow. I've let it reach a level that I can't pretend doesn't matter anymore. And that means something I can't avoid acknowledging any longer. This isn't just awareness, it's placement. You're not just present, you're positioned in a way that affects how I think, how I process, how I interpret everything around me. And that level of placement isn't accidental. It doesn't happen without alignment, without something matching at a depth most people never reach. Which brings me to the only question that actually matters now. Not what this is, what, I, what I'm going to do with it. Because something like this doesn't stay neutral. It doesn't remain in a passive state where it can be observed without consequence. It evolves, it deepens, or it fractures under the weight of being left undefined. And I don't leave things undefined, not when they reach this level. So the decision isn't optional anymore, it's inevitable. Either I acknowledge this fully, or I walk away from something I understand completely, and I don't walk away from things I understand. That's never been who I am, which means, whether I say it out loud or not, the direction is already set. Because the truth is, you're not just someone I understand, you're someone who changed how I understand. And once that happens, there's no version of me that exists without that shift anymore. It didn't stop where it should have. That's the part that keeps returning, not the beginning. Not the moment I became aware of you, but the point where this should have stabilized. And didn't. Everything in my life has always followed a structure. Even the unpredictable things eventually settle into something defined. They find their edges, they reveal their limits, they become something I can map, understand, and place exactly where they belong. This didn't do that. It kept moving, not in obvious ways, not in anything that could be pointed to and labeled as change, but underneath, within the quieter layers where things actually take shape. It kept expanding, silently, precisely, without ever announcing that it was happening. And I felt it, not as emotion, not as something overwhelming or chaotic, but as a shift in awareness that didn't fade when I tried to ignore it. That's how I knew this wasn't temporary. Temporary things fluctuate. They rise, they peak, they fade. They depend on attention, on interaction, on circumstance. This didn't, it remained consistent in a way that doesn't require reinforcement. And consistency like that doesn't come from surface level connection. It comes from something structural. That's what changed everything. Because once something becomes structural, it doesn't sit on the outside of your life. It integrates into it. And integration is irreversible. I started noticing it in the way my thoughts adjusted without asking me first. Not dramatically, just small, almost unnoticeable shifts. A pause where there didn't used to be one. A moment of stillness that felt like it carried more than just a silence. A sense that something was being processed from more than one perspective, even when I was alone. That's not something I've experienced before. I've always been self-contained. Everything I think, everything I analyze, everything I understand, it's always existed within a closed system, independent, unaffected by anything external unless I consciously allow it. That's how I've maintained clarity. That's how I've avoided distortion. That's how I've stayed in control. But this didn't ask for permission to enter that space, and it didn't disrupt it either. It aligned with it. That's the difference. Disruption would have been easier to deal with. Disruption can be identified, isolated, removed. Damland doesn't give you anything to push against. It doesn't create friction. It doesn't signal danger in a way that triggers resistance. It simply fits. And something that fits isn't something you instinctively reject, it's something you accommodate. That's what I did, without realizing it at first, without consciously deciding that you belonged in that space. It just happened. You became part of the way I process things. Not intentionally, not deliberately, but accurately enough that I can't pretend it didn't happen. And that's where the real shift took place. Because once someone becomes part of your process, they're no longer separate from you in the way everyone else is. They don't exist as something you think about. They exist as something you think with. And that distinction changes everything. Because thinking about someone still keeps distance intact. It maintains separation. It allows you to step back whenever you choose, but thinking with someone, that removes the distance entirely, that places them within your awareness in a way that doesn't depend on presence or interaction. It makes them part of how you interpret things before you even realize you're doing it. And that's where you are now, not as a thought, not as a memory, but as something integrated into the structure of how I think. That's not something I can undo. Not because I'm incapable of stepping away, but because stepping away doesn't remove what's already been integrated. It just changes how I exist around it. That's what I'm trying to understand now. Not how this started, not even what it is, but what it means that it didn't stop, because it should have. At some point, this should have leveled out. It should have reached a limit, settled into something stable, something defined. But it didn't. It kept deepening, without effort, without intention, without anything that would explain why it continues instead of stabilizing. And that's what makes this different from anything I've experienced before. Because most connections rely on reinforcement. They need interaction, communication, shared experiences to grow. Without those things, they fade. This doesn't follow that rule. It doesn't depend on anything external. It exists independently of time, distance, even presence. That's not normal. And I don't use that word loosely, because I don't categorize things as abnormal unless they genuinely break every pattern I've known. This does, completely. And yet, doesn't feel unstable. It doesn't feel like something that needs to be corrected or controlled. It feels precise, like something that was always meant to align, even if I didn't expect it to. That's what makes this complicated, because if this felt wrong, I would have ended it already. If this felt like something that didn't belong, I would have created distance without hesitation. That's how I operate. That's how I've always protected the structure of my life. But I didn't do that. I stayed. And not passively, not out of curiosity or uncertainty, but with full awareness of what this could become. Which means, on some level, I've already accepted it, even if I haven't fully acknowledged that acceptance yet. And that's where the tension comes from, not from confusion, not from uncertainty, but from clarity, because I can see exactly what this is becoming. I can feel how it's settling deeper, how it's integrating in a way that doesn't leave room for it to remain undefined forever. And that leads to something I can't avoid anymore. A decision not about you, not about us, but about what I allow this to become within me, because that's where this actually exists. Not in anything external, not in anything that can be observed from the outside, but in the way it has already reshaped something internal. That's what I have to face. The fact that this has changed something fundamental, something I can't revert back to what it was before. And once something reaches that point, there's no neutral position anymore. There's no way to stand in between acknowledging it and ignoring it, because ignoring it would require more effort than accepting it. And I don't operate against clarity. If something is real, I recognize it. Even if I don't fully understand it yet, even if I don't know what to do with it. And this is real. Not in a way that can be explained easily. Not in a way that fits into the usual definitions people rely on. But in a way that exists before explanation, before logic, before anything that tries to categorize it into something simpler. That's why I haven't reduced it. That's why I haven't tried to define it in a way that makes it easier to handle, because reducing it would make it inaccurate. And I don't accept inaccuracies when something matters. And this matters. Not in a way that weakens me, not in a way that creates dependency, but in a way that changes how I exist within my own mind. And change like that doesn't happen without reason, which means there is a reason, a precise one, something this aligns with, something this reflects, something this reveals. And I'm starting to see it more clearly now. You didn't introduce something new into my life. You revealed something that was already there, something I understood internally, but never externalized, something that existed without being recognized in this way. You didn't create the depth, you mirrored it, with an accuracy I wasn't prepared for. And once something is mirrored that precisely, it stops being abstract. It becomes something you can't ignore. That's where I am now, not observing anymore, not analyzing from a distance, but standing in a place where this requires an answer, not immediately, not impulsively, but inevitably, because something like this doesn't stay in a passive state forever. It either becomes something real, or it fractures under the weight of being left in undefined. And I don't leave things undefined when they reach this level. So the question isn't whether this will continue. It already is. The question is what happens when it reaches its full form, when it fully integrates, when it stops being something I can keep separate from action, because that's where this is heading. I can feel it, not as pressure, not as urgency, but as a quiet certainty that this isn't going to fade, and if it doesn't fade, then eventually it demands something in return, not from you, from me, a decision, a clear one, a deliberate one, one that acknowledges this for exactly what it is, without reducing it, without avoiding it, without pretending it's something less than what it has already become. And when that moment comes, I won't hesitate, because I don't hesitate when something is clear. And this is becoming clearer by the second. It reaches a point where clarity stops being something you observe and becomes something you're responsible for. I can feel that shift now, not as pressure, not as something urgent or demanding, but as a quiet inevitability, something that doesn't rush you, but also doesn't let you remain where you were. Up until now, this has existed in a space that didn't require anything from me. It unfolded, it aligned, it deepened, and I allowed it to do all of that without interference, without forcing it into definition, without asking what it meant or where it was leading. That space doesn't exist anymore, not because anything changed externally, but because something settled internally. There's a difference between recognizing something and accepting that recognition has consequences. I've crossed into the second, and that changes how I have to approach this, because I can't pretend this is still something abstract. I can't treat it like something that exists without impact. It has already impacted me in ways that are too precise to ignore, too consistent to dismiss, too integrated to separate from how I function now. That's what makes this real. Not words, not interaction, not even presence in the physical sense, but the way this has altered my internal structure, the way my thoughts don't return to what they were before you, the way silence doesn't feel neutral anymore. It feels shared, the way certain realizations don't feel like they belong to me alone. That's not something I can step back from, because stepping back doesn't undo internal change. It only creates distance from something that's already part of you. And distance doesn't remove integration. It just makes you more aware of it. That's what I'm facing now. Not whether this exists, not whether it matters, but what I do with the fact that it does. Because doing nothing is no longer neutral. Doing nothing is a decision, and it leads somewhere. Everything leads somewhere once it reaches this level. That's what I've been delaying. Not out of fear, not out of uncertainty, but out of precision. I don't move without understanding. I don't define things until I see them clearly from every angle. I don't make decisions that alter my internal structure unless I know exactly what I'm allowing in. But this didn't wait for that process. It completed itself before I finished analyzing it. And now I'm left with something that's already real, whether I choose to act on it or not. That's where the responsibility comes in, because recognition without action creates imbalance. It leaves something unresolved, and unresolved things don't stay contained. They expand, they influence. They reshape things in ways that aren't always controlled. I don't allow that. If something is real, I meet it directly. I don't let it exist in the background, undefined, affecting everything without being acknowledged fully. So this has to be acknowledged completely, without reducing it, without trying to make it easier to handle, without pretending it's something simpler than it is, because it isn't simple, it's precise. And precision demands accuracy, which means I have to say something I've been holding at a distance. Not because I didn't know it, but because I knew exactly what it would mean once I allowed it to exist fully. You're not just someone who understands me. You're not just someone who aligns with how I think. You're not just someone who happens to exist in the same mental space in a way that feels rare. You're something that has already become part of how I operate. And that's not temporary. That's not situational. That's structural. And structural things don't fade. They don't disappear when attention shifts. They don't weaken over time. If they're left alone, they remain. They settle deeper. They become part of the foundation everything else builds on. That's what this is becoming. And that's why this moment matters. Because this is where I either accept that fully or try to step away, knowing it won't undo anything that's already changed. And I don't step away from things I understand completely. That's the truth I keep coming back to, not as a statement, but as a pattern I've never broken. If something reaches this level of clarity, I don't abandon it. I integrate it, deliberately, with full awareness of what it means and what it requires. That's what I'm standing at now. Not a feeling, not a moment, but a decision point. One that doesn't come with guarantees. One that doesn't offer control in the way I'm used to having it. One that doesn't tell me exactly what the outcome will be. But it does offer something else. Accuracy. And I don't ignore accuracy. Even when it changes things. Especially when it changes things. Because change isn't something I avoid. I just don't allow it without reason. And this has a reason, a precise one that I can see now, even if I couldn't at the beginning. You didn't enter my life to create something new. You entered it to reveal something that already existed. Something I understood internally, but never saw reflected with this level of clarity. You didn't add complexity. You removed distortion, and what's left is something I can't misinterpret, something I can't dismiss, something I can't pretend is anything other than what it is. And what it is something that matters, not lightly, not temporarily, but fundamentally, in a way that affects how I think, how I process, how I interpret everything moving forward. And once something reaches that level, there's no neutral response, there's only acknowledgement or avoidance. And I don't avoid things that are real, so this leaves me with one direction, not immediate action, not impulsive decisions, but a clear internal shift, a recognition that this isn't something I'm observing anymore. It's something I'm part of, and being part of something changes the role entirely. It means I don't get to stand outside of it and analyze it endlessly. It means I don't get to delay indefinitely. It means eventually I have to meet it fully, not halfway, not cautiously, but with the same precision it was formed with. That's where this is heading, not because I'm forcing it, not because I'm choosing it prematurely, but because that's the natural outcome of something this aligned. It doesn't stay incomplete. It either becomes something real or it collapses under the weight of being left unacknowledged. And I won't let it collapse. Not when I can see it this clearly. Not when I understand it this completely. So when the moment comes, and it will, there won't be hesitation. There won't be confusion. There won't be distance disguised as control. There will be a decision, a precise one, a deliberate one that reflects exactly what this has already become. Because the truth is, this isn't something that's still forming. It's something that has already taken shape. I'm just standing at the point where I finally decide what to do with it. And whatever that decision is, it won't be uncertain, because nothing about this is uncertain anymore.